Alrighty, guys. So, welcome to part one, lecture one of two on the later years of Frank Lloyd Wright. So, Frank has absolutely so many works from his later years, and I'm only really highlighting the better known or my personal favorites. I've called this lecture Frank Lloyd Wright, the later years in the Usonian style, because my personal favorite line of houses that Frank Lloyd Wright built are called Usonians. So we're going to learn about this, but we're also going to learn about some of the works that everyone knows him by. Falling Water, which is just above me right here. Guggenheim, just to my just to the right. And of course, in this class, there is going to be more drama. This is the period where Frank Lloyd Wright kind of almost starts this quasi cult called the Taliesin Fellowship, where he gathers around him this gang of young apostles that basically pay to work for him. And they admire his every move. They spend great chunks of their lives with him, entertaining him and his wife in the evening with plays and musical numbers. This is a period during Wright's life where finally he comes back from the Great Depression, and we'll talk about how he does that. And he gets finally large commission after large commission. So he's not stuck building houses for the first time in his life. He's really being recognized as a great architect. But this is also a period starting off the bat where the modernists from Europe are getting all of the commissions in America. Frank Lloyd Wright has been kind of painted in this period of his life as a has-been, as an old sort of washed up arts and crafts architect, not appropriate for the modern age. And so we'll see his adventure and how he overcomes this reputation. He's a very old man at this point. He lives until 91 years of age, so he really sees America itself develop as a country. He's alive for most of its history. We'll see how he finally, for one final time, rises from the ashes of his reputation being slandered and rises again, becoming the most famous architect in America for the second time, in spite of all of these modernist architects who we're going to learn about after the last Frank Lloyd Wright class, who are kind of now competing with him on the international stage. So let's get into where we left off yesterday. So to review from yesterday, Frank Lloyd Wright has gotten himself into another affair, and his reputation has tanked. And at 62 years of age now, in 1929, he's faced with the Great Depression. So his long, turbulent career seems once again at an end. As you can imagine, wealthy clients no longer knocked at his door, and as if this wasn't enough, many younger architects in his day, in the 30s, began dismissing him as a has-been. So while weathering the Great Depression, to keep his name and ideas alive, Ogavana urged Wright to lecture and to write. First, articles on architecture, and then a full autobiography. The autobiography specifically was a really significant move to help resell himself to the public. He presented himself as the man who could understand everything about humanity and its interaction with the landscape and about architecture. It made you feel this dire craving to have him design your home. Then, in 1932, to help pay their bills, Ogavana suggested something infinitely more brilliant: that they start an apprenticeship program out of their house at Taliesin. They could call it the Taliesin Fellowship. It would attract eager students whose parents would each pay a meager $650 a year to live and work alongside Wright himself. So Wright worked to make Taliesin this self-sufficient community surrounded by farms, somewhat like a medieval monastery. All the apprentices were required to do at least 4 hours a day of manual labor, and required to learn instruments to play in the evenings, to write and put on plays to exercise their creativity, and participate in themed banquets. But the real honor obviously came from working side by side with the great architect himself. Taliesin would provide not just an education in architecture, but in furniture design, weaving, photography, printing, music, and handicrafts. The Taliesin Fellowship, as Wright and Olgivanna called it, began properly in 1932, and all of the young students came to believe that Wright was a genius. It was massively bolstering his ego, lost during the early years of the Depression. The apprentices were put to work wherever Wright decided to build new buildings or repair new ones on his dilapidated estate at Taliesin. The apprentices designed and built their own housing quarters and any new farm buildings the estate might need. There wasn't much proper architecture to do at the start of the Depression, but Wright put his apprentices to work brainstorming new ideas for America's future. On the outside, critics charged that his students were little more than slaves on a modern-day plantation, but Wright insisted that they learned best by doing. They all worked from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., and all seemed fairly happy about it. Olgivanna, meanwhile, obsessively managed the apprentices' lives, who soon became like family. She went so far as to arrange their marriages and negotiate their divorces. Taliesin became something like a cult, and Mr. and Mrs. Wright as the royalty at the top. They regarded themselves as an army under siege. The rest of the world simply didn't understand them. But while times seemed up at Taliesin, only a decade before, you have to remember, Wright was hailed as a revolutionary. But now, the revolutionaries were the radical architects of the international style from Europe, like Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe. The spotlight shone on them, and we're going to learn about them in the next few classes. But America, as seen by them, lagged behind, or so thought many modernist architects. So since the end of World War I, European modernists have been designing what they saw as the new industrialized architecture, fully functionalist and intended to serve the working class. You know, there were a lot more socialist circles in Europe, and Frank Lloyd Wright and a lot of American forefront architects were kind of seen as only serving the upper classes who could afford it. You know, European architects were more focused on, creating apartment buildings and public buildings. These modernist architects in Europe had at one point been influenced by the simplicity and openness of Wright's prairie style in their youth, but now they had moved on. They worshipped modern technology and sought ways to symbolize it, so they had, very little interest in using wood and stone, which, in this modern age now struck them as old-fashioned, and so by extension, Frank Lloyd Wright as old-fashioned, this old-fashioned arts and crafts architect who won't wake up to the times. To them, there was much more interest in glass and metal, these easily mass-produced materials, affordable by everyone. And the 20th century was supposed to be the great world of the machine, the great new world of the machine. But Wright didn't agree with this. He was a man who believed thoroughly in the crafts, so the international style architects didn't even consider him an architect. He was a washed-up craftsman. But Wright professed in turn nothing but contempt for the European modernists. He called them paper architects playing with flat images. He wrote, just because people live in the machine age does not mean their houses should look like machines. He called European modernist houses cardboard, mechanical, artificial, and soulless. For Wright, architecture was a very spiritual thing. It should touch the heart and change the person. It should complement nature, not subjugate it. So, we've got this antagonism between the American arts and crafts architects and the European modernists. So this would all come to a head in 1932. So in 1932, the Museum of Modern Art in New York City held this exhibition on the international style, which had begun to influence Americans from Europe, and they actually invited Frank Lloyd Wright to contribute a design as this notable American architect. But Wright, being the sort of obstinate, ego-headed person that he is, actually threatened to withdraw because he hadn't been given a bigger position in the show. He even wrote letters to curators claiming that they'd ruined architecture and become European slaves. To them, he was this nasty old man, and they almost kicked him out of the exhibition altogether. But in the end, they let him send this very beautiful design for a building he was working on, a theoretical building. And the guidebook for the exhibition, it praised Wright for his individualism, but otherwise, dismissed him as one of a number of old architects, kind of, celebrating the history of American architecture, but definitely not, talking about him as a forward-thinking architect in any way. He was dismissed as this sort of has-been. So I've been leading up this whole time to Wright's big comeback. Obviously, we have this class and another class about him, so he's made a comeback. But what would be his big comeback? It would be this building, Falling Water, probably his most famous, recognizable building. This challenge that he's this has-been, this washed-up arts and crafts architect, Wright was able to finally take up that challenge and completely remake himself with Falling Water. So, finally a client, E.J. Kaufman, the father of one of his apprentices, wrote to him asking if he has time to build him a small house in 1934. This, weekend hideaway for his family next to their favorite waterfall on a little stream in western Pennsylvania. They loved to picnic on this dry spot on the rock over which the waterfall cascaded. And this was Wright's chance to come back strong and show up European modernism, to show the world what he could do again. Wright visited the site and had the apprentices make an elaborate plot plan of the landscape, and then they did nothing for 3 months. They went back to Taliesin, and all of a sudden, time caught up with them. Wright got a telephone call from Mr. Kaufman, who happened to be just a few hours away from Taliesin, and wanted to see if the plans were coming along. Wright told them to come around. They were waiting for him. He was just 3 hours away, so when Wright hung up, he started to draw. He worked so fast that his apprentices had to feed him pencils when they broke. And when E.J. Kaufman walked in, Wright presented his models as if he'd been working on them for months. When built, it turned out to be a beautiful response to its site. An ordinary architect would have built the house away from the steep, rocky, dangerous waterfall and just allowed, a grand window to look out onto it. But Wright decided to build the house right on top of the waterfall. The foundations are literally coming out of the rock. Its slabs are anchored into and gripping the rock, and the waterfall flows under the house. This amazing foundation. As Wright said, like a tree, the huge stone pillars would serve as the center of the house and trunk the home, and the rooms would stem from it like branches. He used these flat white planes as if to say, okay, European modernists, you want to do it that way? I'll show you how to do it that way. He took some of their ideas and integrated them with some of his ideas. He too caught on that there was, something beautiful about flat simplicity of the modernists, but he blended it with the best of the arts and crafts aesthetics. And plus, to top it all off, this house had steps down to the waterfall, down to a small natural pool that formed before the precipice of the waterfall, so you could go swimming and bathe in the waterfall itself. It's this amazing home. And the centerpiece of the house was, of course, the fireplace, as always, as in all Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, where the family was supposed to gather. And amazingly, Wright had the exact flat spot on the cliff where the family used to sit. It broke through the floor here, just in front of the fireplace, so that the family would never lose their favorite spot. This kind of amazing integration of a memory. However, it was the only building that Wright ever built that was not entirely safe. His mind had kind of outdone himself here. The design he had imagined was so futuristic, so he came up with methods that hadn't been tested. Reinforced concrete was only a fairly recent new thing back then, and his draftsmen, engineers, and builders just assumed that he knew what he was doing, and assumed what he was doing made sense because he was, a genius. Some structural cracks, however, appeared during construction, but Wright patched it up and told his workers to just trust in his calculations. Amazingly, the foundations of the house held strong for 60 years, but after this point it partially collapsed, but thankfully it's restored today and you can go visit it. But it is the Great Depression era, it is the 1930s, so lots of people just don't have the money for large-scale house commissions like Falling Water. But during the austerity of the 1930s, the Great Depression, Wright and his apprentices were hard at work on something new. This personal project, designing a line of cheap, functional, and naturally beautiful, affordable houses, anticipating the demand for them would come. And sure enough, when his first commission for such a house came, such a house was already sketched in the archives of Taliesin. So this happened in 1936 when Wright was approached at Taliesin by Herbert and Catherine Jacobs, who asked if he might design a house that would cost only $5,000 if it was possible. This was a young couple who, in the midst of the Depression, were only making a modest $20 a week. It was worth a lot more than today's money, you have to remember, but it was still a meager wage. Frank Lloyd Wright called this plan for the line of modern houses he had Usonian, named after the United States, so US-onian. It's supposed to be, the residential architecture of the majority of the population of the US. So you can think of it as Usonian. But this was the first Usonian house. This was kind of their experiment. And it was basically a single-story, flat-roofed house built on a concrete slab and joined to a carport. And after they finished this, Wright and his apprentices realized and believed that this could be replicated all across the country, even for the poorest citizens at the height of the Great Depression. So the Usonian house, and this house in particular, offered a much simpler, more economic way of living. So you'll notice it's L-shaped in plan, and it puts the living room in one wing and the private bedroom spaces in the other wing. And these are connected by a narrow hallway in sort of the groin of the L. And then at the crux of the L, you have the kitchen and the bathroom to save on plumbing costs. So this is where the only place where water goes into and comes out of the house. And then you also have the fireplace to save on heating costs. And the fireplace is the only heating element in this house, but it's such a small house that having it at the center essentially heats both wings of the house evenly. In addition, Wright had this very genius but very simple way of making you feel like you had a big yard despite having a small house. So instead of putting the house at the center of the lot, the L space allows the house to sit at the extreme corner of the lot and maximize yard space. So you'll notice the house turns a mostly blank wall to the street, and this is for privacy, with only these very high clerestory windows to let in light, preserving privacy and lighting the room more broadly. But then on the other side, on the backyard side, you have this screen of large glass windows and doors opening to the backyard. And this means that both the bedrooms and the living room open via window screens into a generous backyard, which, brought the garden, brought the outside into the occupant's daily life. It'll remind you of the textile block houses a little bit. But the busy street on the other side of the house could be put out of sight, out of mind, after the occupants returned from a busy day of work. They could just have this view of their backyard and not have to worry about the outside world anymore. And quite a depressing outside world it was at the height of the Great Depression. So, structurally, this was very cheaply built as well, although it looks quite classy. So the walls were made of a plywood core, the cheapest kind of wood, plywood, sandwiched by building paper for insulation, and then sandwiched again with these cheap pine wood boards and battens on either side to kind of pretty up the core of the house. But these wooden parts of the house, these wooden elements, are entirely non-supporting. They act solely as space dividers. The supporting elements, the only supporting elements in the house, are these brick piers, brick rectangular piers that you see, and it could be used, very few and far between because of the simple, flat, well-balanced cantilevered roofs. So Wright and his apprentices had developed this style which they thought would revolutionize the American home, and Wright even wrote a manifesto of what he sought to achieve. He was so excited about this new venture. He wrote that above all, it was necessary to get rid of all unnecessary materials and eliminate building time to as short as possible, or even to make the construction so simple that the occupants could build it themselves. So Wright had these kind of rules of subtraction to make a Usonian house as cheap as possible. So one of the rules was that visible roofs are expensive to build and maintain, and for such small houses unnecessary. A flat roof, a simple flat roof will do. Another rule was that a garage was completely unnecessary, a carport will do. And another rule was that the old-fashioned basement was always flooding or growing mold. It was expensive to maintain, and it was just used for excess storage. Eliminate the basement and replace it with an underfloor system of heating coils to free up room in the house. and will heat the house the old Roman way, as Frank Lloyd Wright says, or from underneath the floor. And the final and most important rule had to do with materials. So, to assist in the planning and construction, we need only 5 materials: wood, brick, cement, paper, and glass. That's all these houses were built out of. So in the end, this system ended up working very well in varying climates across the nation. Between 1937 and 1954, Usonian houses were built all the way from California to South Carolina, all across the nation. And the young apprentices at Taliesin would often be assigned to a Usonian project, often, living on site for months during construction to act as an agent for Wright to ensure that everything went according to plan. They even had clients during the height of the Great Depression who simply purchased a plan from Wright, just a paper blueprint plan, and then built their own Usonian homes using their own hands and simple tools. And this is at the moment my personal favorite Frank Lloyd Wright house of all time. I've never been here, I've never visited it, but it just speaks to me. I would love to live here, and I just love the philosophy behind making it as cheap as possible, but also making it as beautiful as possible. I think, this is something we really need in the current, housing crisis. Another early Usonian house that got quite a lot of press was this house, the Pope Leahy house. So the story goes that a Time magazine article about the Jacobs house, the last house we learned about, inspired Lauren Pope Leahy, this journalist from DC, to request his own Usonian too in Virginia. And this house was made of mostly cypress and brick to reflect the local landscape, to reflect the wood of the local landscape. As Wright is all about reflecting the materials of the local landscape. And the biggest highlight of this home was its very unusual and artsy windows. So Wright was rethinking the relationship between homes and natural light, and he was experimenting with these patterned perforated windows seen on the clerestory and on repeating forms down the side. So, light and patterned light at that, as you can see from these pictures, would be the adornment of the house. There was no need for buying expensive art to liven up the place because, as the Great Depression is still going on. And he wanted the house to feel private for the occupant, but not to waste electricity during the day. So these patterned, very frequent windows provided all of the light you need during the day. So you really only need to turn on your lights at night. So he used clerestory windows wherever possible, especially when roofs changed elevations. And again, you'll notice it's just the clerestory windows on the side that faces the street for the privacy, for the shutting out of the public world, and then the big screened windows facing the backyard, maximizing the backyard space with the L-shaped plan. And so, this, very artistic perforated window kind of characterized every Usonian house, and soon, every subsequent Usonian house received their own design of perforated windows. So if you go to any of the sort of later Usonian houses, they all have their own kind of signature windows, almost like a kind of family crest. So as I said, the new work on these Usonians became, the main project at Taliesin, and it really revived Wright and energized the fellowship. They had, a lot of work in the Great Depression. But despite Wright having these dreams that he would create architecture for the masses, to be, this new democratic architect that would educate the American people to a great new aesthetic, in the end, only 60 affordable Usonian houses were ever built, which is quite a good number, but it definitely never led to a new American suburban architecture like Frank Lloyd Wright would have wanted. In 1936, towards the end of the Great Depression, a new client approached Wright, Herbert Johnson, president of the Johnson Wax Company of Racine, Wisconsin. He needed a new administration building, and so this was Wright's first chance at a large-scale commission in years since the Great Depression. Wright wanted to create the perfect productive environment for workers as in the Larkin building. Wright and his apprentices finalized the drawings in just 10 days to present to them in the board. They said, "You will have a temple of work. You will have a place you will love to be in." Again, like the Larkin building, it was in a sort of industrial zone, so he wanted it sealed and lit from above. So, wanting to go the same route as the Larkin headquarters, Wright wanted a massive skylight on top of the offices in the Johnson Wax headquarters to light it without electricity. Because it is still the Great Depression, and this company, though it has the money to commission a great building, would like to cut costs wherever possible. And he would experiment with this new material called Pyrex glass tubings. Essentially, it was a massive flat skylight that refracted light even on a cloudy day into the interior, so you could light the entire office space without a single voltage of electricity. And this was all supposed to be held up by these reinforced concrete slender lily pad columns geared to hold its weight. But all of this took much more time and money than was bargained for, and inspectors coming to the construction site insisted that the slender columns could not possibly bear the weight Wright's plans called for. So insulted, Wright actually held a public demonstration with sandbags piling on 10 times the weight required before the columns cracked, so construction could proceed. And you can see a picture of this down in the bottom right hand corner, and I believe there's a video of it floating around somewhere too. So, as you can imagine, light in this office space, since Wright insisted on no proper windows, came from above in between the lily pads. And the employees reported that it felt very serene, like sort of being underwater, under a lake, or in a magical forest. And this, this really helped optimism and positivity in the workplace. But the idea was that the shafts of the reinforced concrete, these sort of lily pads or tree trunks, were designed to have this regular momentum to break up the space in a sort of mathematical way, so that a sense of individuality is preserved among the employees. And then if you notice, especially if you watch, videos of this building, I've included one on Canvas. The office furniture, in the name of organic architecture, is, a combination of wood surface and curved metal, matching the aesthetics of the rest of the building, the elevator shafts, the front doors, the storage units, the spatial dividers. And here again is Wright kind of pushing the boundaries of modernism, showing how it's done correctly with these flat planes, with the industrial aesthetic of steel and glass, and mixing it with the arts and crafts with a sense of warmth and artisanry. Wright was very proud of this building. He really liked designing office spaces because it's the place that people spend the most of their time in. And he said of this building in particular that organic architecture designed this great building to be as inspiring a place to work in as any cathedral ever was in which to worship. It was meant to be a socio-architectural interpretation of modern business at its top and best. There were eventually some problems with this building. Frank Lloyd Wright, again, like in Falling Water, stretched himself too thin, got a little bit too excited using these new materials. And so the glass tubing in the roof couldn't be sealed properly, and water poured in whenever it rained. There's a long list of failings in Wright's later buildings: roofs that leak, cantilevers that sag, ventilation systems that just don't work, drafty windows. And so this tells us something important about Frank Lloyd Wright's mindset in his later years. He was always reaching for the vision that lay beyond the physical building. He was always stretching the bounds of what was possible with today's technology. He was willing to tolerate failings if he could push the standard of architecture towards the future. And despite the leaks, Herbert Johnson and his team was so dazzled by this building that he asked Wright to design him a home. And this may just be the most extravagant home Frank Lloyd Wright ever designed, but we'll talk about this in the next lesson.